Lily Peterson was 7 years old when she vanished from Maple Ridge Elementary School on a crisp October afternoon in 1999. The last person to see her was Mrs. Henderson, the school librarian, who watched through the tall windows as Lily skipped across the playground in her bright blue sandals, the ones her grandmother had bought her just weeks before at the downtown shopping mall. Those sandals became the detail that haunted everyone who knew her, mentioned in every missing person report, every news broadcast, every prayer whispered by her desperate parents during the endless nights that followed. If you're following this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we continue bringing you these remarkable true stories that show the resilience of the human spirit. The Peterson family lived in a modest two-story house on Elm Street in the small town of Riverdale, Ohio, where David worked as a mechanic at Murphy's Auto Shop and Linda taught second grade at the same elementary school Lily attended. They were the kind of family that neighbors waved to every morning, whose front yard was always perfectly maintained with seasonal flowers planted in neat rows, whose holiday decorations went up exactly when they should and came down promptly after each celebration. David coached Little League Baseball on weekends, and Linda volunteered at the local animal shelter during her summer breaks. They attended First Baptist Church every Sunday, where Lily sang in the children's choir with a voice that was clear and sweet as mountain spring water. When Lily didn't meet her mother at their usual spot by the flagpole that Tuesday afternoon, Linda's first thought was that her daughter had simply gotten distracted, perhaps helping another teacher clean erasers or feeding Patches, the classroom hamster that Lily had been particularly fond of since the school year began. Lily was the kind of child who noticed when others needed help, who would spend her recess time comforting a crying classmate or picking up litter on the playground without being asked. Her teachers often commented on her mature sense of responsibility and her natural empathy for others, but as minutes stretched into an hour, panic began its cold crawl up Linda's spine like ice water in her veins. She searched every hallway, every bathroom, every supply closet in the school building, calling Lily's name with increasing desperation. She checked the nurse's office, the principal's office, the cafeteria where leftover lunch trays sat abandoned on long tables. She questioned every teacher, every custodian, every volunteer parent who had been in the building that day. David arrived within 20 minutes of Linda's frantic phone call, his work clothes still stained with motor oil, his face already drained of color as he abandoned his job mid-repair and drove through town at dangerous speeds to reach his family. Together, they combed through the surrounding neighborhood with methodical determination, calling Lily's name until their voices grew hoarse and raw. They knocked on every door within a 5-mile radius, showing Lily's school photo to anyone who would look, asking the same questions over and over again with growing desperation. Had anyone seen a little girl with brown pigtails? Had anyone noticed a child in bright blue sandals? Had anyone seen anything unusual, anything at all that might provide a clue to their daughter's whereabouts? The answers were always the same. Polite concern, genuine sympathy, but no information that brought them any closer to finding Lily. The police arrived as the sun began its descent behind the maple trees that gave their town its name, casting long shadows across the school parking lot where David and Linda stood clutching each other for support. Detective James Riley, a 20-year veteran of the force with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, took the case personally from the moment he saw the school photo of Lily. Gap-toothed smile, pigtails tied with yellow ribbons that matched her favorite dress, those bright green eyes that seemed to hold all the mischief and wonder that 7-year-olds possess. He had a daughter of his own, just a year older than Lily, and the thought of something happening to her made his stomach clench with protective fury. Detective Riley organized search parties that scoured the nearby woods with flashlights and bloodhounds, their beams cutting through the gathering darkness as volunteers called Lily's name. into the silent trees. They dragged the pond at Riverside Park, where families often brought their children to feed the ducks and where Lily had learned to skip stones the previous summer. They interviewed every adult who had been at the school that day: teachers, administrators, maintenance staff, delivery drivers, parent volunteers who had helped with the Halloween party planning committee. Each conversation was documented meticulously, every detail recorded and cross-referenced, every alibi verified and double-checked. The investigation consumed the small town like a fever. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the search efforts, arriving with thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches, organizing themselves into grid patterns to cover every inch of forest, every abandoned building, every drainage ditch within a 50-mile radius. Local businesses donated food and supplies, keeping the command center at the fire station stocked with necessities for the growing army of searchers. The Petersons' phone rang constantly with tips from well-meaning citizens, most sincere but ultimately fruitless leads that sent investigators racing across state lines only to find dead ends and broken hopes. Someone claimed to have seen a girl matching Lily's description at a gas station 40 miles away, holding hands with a woman who looked nervous and kept checking over her shoulder. Another caller insisted they had spotted her blue sandals abandoned beside Highway 12, near the truck stop where long-haul drivers grabbed coffee and fuel for the long stretches of interstate ahead. A psychic from 3 states away called to say she had visions of Lily near water, then near mountains, then in a place with red dirt and endless sky. Every lead was pursued with desperate thoroughness, Detective Riley and his team following each thread, no matter how thin or unlikely it seemed, because they knew that sometimes the most impossible leads turned out to be the key to everything. Weeks turned into months, with the relentless passage of time that felt both impossibly slow and frighteningly fast. The yellow ribbons tied to every tree on Elm Street began to fade and fray in the weather, their bright color dulling to pale cream in the harsh winter sun. The missing person posters that had been plastered across every storefront and telephone pole started to curl at the edges, their laminated surfaces cracking in the cold, torn by wind and rain, until Lily's smiling face became fragmented and obscured. Linda took a leave of absence from teaching, unable to bear the sight of children Lily's age, learning to read and write and laugh together in the classroom where she had once found such joy and purpose. David threw himself into work with manic intensity, staying at Murphy's garage until well past closing time, because going home meant facing the empty bedroom with its untouched dollhouse and carefully arranged stuffed animals, the blue Sandals matching pair sitting lonely in the closet, like a monument to everything they had lost. He would arrive home, exhausted and covered in grease, having spent 12 or 14 hours losing himself in the mechanical precision of engine repair, the logical problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough determination. But no amount of work could fix the broken place in his heart where his daughter's laughter used to live. Their marriage nearly didn't survive the crushing weight of grief and guilt and the terrible uncertainty that hung over every day like storm clouds that never broke into rain. David began drinking heavily, disappearing for days at a time on what he called searches, but which were really desperate attempts to run from a pain that followed him everywhere like his own shadow. He would drive for hours through unfamiliar towns, checking truck stops and diners and bus stations, showing Lily's photo to strangers who looked at him with pity and concern, but never with recognition. Linda channeled her anguish into advocacy work, joining support groups for parents of missing children and volunteering with organizations dedicated to child safety, finding some small measure of purpose in helping other families navigate the nightmare that had become her daily reality. They attended therapy together and separately, sitting in comfortable chairs in Dr. Patricia Morgan's office, while learning to navigate a world that had suddenly become foreign and threatening. Dr. Morgan helped them understand that grief wasn't a problem to be solved, but a process to be endured, that healing didn't mean forgetting, but learning to carry their love for Lily in a way that didn't destroy them. Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild their relationship on the foundation of shared loss and enduring love, recognizing that they were the only two people in the world who truly understood the magnitude of what had been taken from them. The years passed with the cruel indifference of time that waits for no one's healing. David and Linda celebrated birthdays for a daughter who wasn't there, lighting candles on cakes they couldn't eat, while wondering if somewhere in the world Lily was celebrating too. They set a place at the dinner table on holidays that went unfilled, maintained Christmas traditions for an audience of two that felt hollow without the excited squeals and wrapping paper chaos that had once defined their December mornings. They kept Lily's bedroom exactly as she had left it. Textbooks on the desk where she'd been working on her spelling homework the night before she disappeared. Pajamas folded neatly on the chair where she'd placed them that final morning. Hoping that somehow keeping everything perfect would call her home, they aged in ways that went deeper than the lines around their eyes and the grey that crept into their hair. Their grief settled into a permanent ache that became as much a part of them as breathing, a weight they carried but learned to balance so they could continue moving through the world. Linda returned to teaching after 3 years, finding that working with children brought both pain and healing, that helping other people's daughters learn to read somehow honored the daughter she couldn't help. David was promoted to shop foreman, his dedication to his work and his quiet competence earning the respect of younger mechanics who never knew about the missing piece of his heart. By 2015, 16 years after Lily's disappearance, David and Linda had learned to carry on with something resembling normal life, though normal was a word that had been redefined by loss and resilience and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. David had stopped drinking with the help of AA meetings and the patient support of friends who never gave up on him. Linda had earned a master's degree in grief counseling and spent her summers working with camps for children who had lost parents or siblings. They had never stopped hoping for Lily's return, but the sharp edge of expectation had worn smooth with time, replaced by a quieter kind of faith that held space for miracles while accepting the possibility that some questions would never be answered. They participated in annual remembrance services for missing children, lighting candles and sharing stories with other families who understood the particular ache of ambiguous loss. They kept in touch with Detective Riley even after his retirement, meeting him for coffee every few months to discuss new developments in cold case technology and to reminisce about the daughter he had never stopped trying to find. They maintained the website they had created in the early days of the search, though updates had become increasingly infrequent as the years passed without new information or credible leads to pursue. The house on Elm Street had been paid off years earlier, and they had renovated the kitchen and updated the bathrooms, making changes that honored their life together while still preserving the spaces where Lily's presence felt strongest. They had acquired a golden retriever named Rusty, who slept in the spot where Lily used to curl up on the living room couch, and Linda had started a garden where she grew vegetables for the local food bank and flowers that she arranged in vases throughout the house. Life had texture and meaning again, built on the foundation of their love for each other and their determination to make their daughter's memory a source of light rather than darkness. Then, on a humid Thursday morning in July 2024, their doorbell rang at precisely 9:47 a.m. with the sharp insistence of news that couldn't wait. Linda was washing dishes at the kitchen sink, humming along to a classic rock song on the radio while planning her day around a doctor's appointment and grocery shopping and the pile of essays she needed to grade before the weekend. David had already left for work, kissing her goodbye at the front door with the casual affection of people who had learned not to take ordinary moments for granted. When the doorbell interrupted her morning routine, She dried her hands on the dish towel embroidered with sunflowers that Lily had given her for Mother's Day so many years ago. She expected to find a delivery driver with a package, or perhaps their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, asking to borrow something from their garden shed, or maybe one of the Jehovah's Witnesses who occasionally made their way through the neighborhood with religious pamphlets and earnest smiles. Instead, she found herself face to face with Detective Maria Santos from the state police, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a manila folder clutched in her hands like it contained something precious and fragile. Detective Santos was dressed in a crisp blue suit, with her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, and there was something in her expression that made Linda's heart begin to race before a single word was spoken. "Mrs. Peterson?" Detective Santos asked, her voice gentle but professional, carrying the weight of words that had been carefully chosen and rehearsed. "I'm with the State Bureau of Investigation. May I come in? I have some information about your daughter Lily that I think you'll want to hear." The world tilted on its axis with those simple words, 25 years of carefully constructed emotional walls coming crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. Linda gripped the doorframe with white knuckles, her knees suddenly unreliable as the implications of the detective's presence began to sink in. Information about Lily could mean many things, most of them terrible, some of them wonderful, all of them life-changing in ways she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. She managed to invite Detective Santos inside with a voice that sounded foreign to her own ears, her hands shaking as she dialed David's number, with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. David answered on the first ring with the gruff efficiency of someone who was elbow-deep in an engine repair, but his tone changed immediately when he heard the tremor in Linda's voice. "Come home," she whispered into the phone. "Come home right now. There's someone here about Lily." Lee, he arrived home in 12 minutes, having abandoned his work mid-repair and driven through 3 red lights to get there, his face pale and his work shirt still bearing the evidence of whatever project he had dropped to answer his wife's call. Detective Santos waited patiently while David composed himself, accepting the cup of coffee that Linda offered, with hands that shook only slightly as she poured it from the pot that had been brewing when the doorbell first rang. The detective spread photographs across their kitchen table, the same scarred wooden table where Lily had eaten her last breakfast of chocolate chip pancakes and orange juice, where she had practiced her multiplication tables and colored pictures that still hung on the refrigerator door. The images showed a young woman with shoulder-length brown hair and familiar green eyes, standing outside what appeared to be a rural farmhouse, somewhere with wide skies and endless horizons. She was wearing a simple blue dress that looked homemade, with the kind of careful stitching that spoke of necessity rather than fashion, and she had the cautious posture of someone unaccustomed to being photographed, someone who had learned to avoid attention and blend into the background. Her face was thinner than it should have been, aged by experiences that no child should have endured. But even after 25 years, even with the changes that time and trauma had wrought, Linda knew those eyes with the certainty of DNA and mother's intuition. Those were her daughter's eyes, the same green as spring grass, the same shape as her own grandmother's, the same expression of guarded intelligence that had always made Lily seem older than her years. The story that emerged over the following days was both miraculous and heartbreaking, a tale of survival and manipulation that challenged everything the Petersons thought they knew about evil and resilience and the power of human adaptability. Lily had been found living under the name Mary Sullivan on a remote ranch outside Billings, Montana, as part of what investigators were calling one of the most sophisticated kidnapping and identity manipulation schemes in modern American history. She had been discovered quite by accident when a sharp-eyed county clerk had noticed inconsistencies in documentation related to a property transfer. discrepancies that had led to questions about Mary Sullivan's identity and eventually to DNA testing that confirmed what Linda's heart had known the moment she saw those photographs. Lily had been taken by a woman named Catherine Wallace, a former social worker who had lost custody of her own children years earlier due to mental health issues and drug abuse, and who had spent months carefully selecting and stalking potential targets in small towns across the Midwest. Catherine had approached Lily that October afternoon as she left Maple Ridge Elementary, spinning an elaborate tale about her grandmother being rushed to the hospital with a heart attack and asking for help finding the emergency room entrance because she was too upset to think clearly. She had seemed like a concerned family friend, someone official and trustworthy, exactly the kind of adult that children were taught to help in emergency situations. Catherine had driven Lily hundreds of miles away that same night, using back roads and cash transactions to avoid detection, stopping at remote motels where she paid in advance and used false names on registration forms. Over the course of several weeks, moving from place to place with the practiced efficiency of someone who had planned every detail, she had gradually convinced the traumatized 7-year-old that her parents had died in a terrible car accident, and that she, Catherine, was now her legal guardian and only remaining family. The lies had been carefully constructed and reinforced with forged documents, newspaper clippings about fictional accidents, and a dozen other props designed to make the impossible seem inevitable. The psychological manipulation had been systematic and thorough, conducted by someone who understood child development and trauma responses with the twisted expertise of a predator who had studied her craft. Catherine had isolated Lily completely from the outside world, moving her to the remote Montana ranch where the nearest neighbors were miles away and visitors were rare. She had gradually changed Lily's appearance, cutting and dyeing her hair from brown to blonde and back to brown again, altering her clothing style, even changing the way she spoke by correcting her improper grammar and accent until the Ohio girl's voice was replaced by something more neutral and generic. Most disturbing of all, Catherine had used a combination of emotional manipulation and mild sedatives, herbs, and over-the-counter medications that she claimed were vitamins, to suppress many of Lily's early memories, creating gaps in her recollection that made questioning her past feel frightening and forbidden. Whenever Lily would ask about her life before the accident, Catherine would become upset and withdrawn, making it clear that such questions caused pain and were better left unasked. The child had learned to avoid topics that made her guardian cry, and over time, the memories themselves had become associated with guilt and sadness. For 25 years, Lily had lived as Mary Sullivan, believing herself to be an orphan whose only family was the woman she called Aunt Catherine. She had learned to cook elaborate meals from basic ingredients, to tend to sick animals with intuitive skill, to fix almost anything that broke around the ranch house or in the various outbuildings where they stored equipment and supplies. She had never attended traditional school, instead receiving an education that was carefully controlled and filtered through Catherine's paranoid worldview. She had never had friends her own age, never attended a movie theater or shopping mall, never questioned why they lived so far from any town or why Catherine became nervous and aggressive whenever strangers appeared at their property. The isolation had been so complete that Lily had no frame of reference for understanding that her life was abnormal, no basis for comparison that might have made her question the story she had been told about her origins. Catherine had been skilled at presenting their lifestyle as a choice rather than a prison, emphasizing the peace and self-sufficiency of rural living while painting the outside world as dangerous and corrupt. She had taught Lily to fear strangers, to avoid government officials, to believe that their safety depended on remaining hidden and unnoticed by a world that would separate them if given the chance. Catherine Wallace had died of a massive heart attack 6 months earlier, collapsing in the barn while feeding the horses on a cold February morning. Lily had found her body hours later and had tried unsuccessfully to revive her before calling the emergency number that Catherine had made her memorize years earlier. The paramedics who responded had been struck by the woman's obvious grief and confusion, her complete lack of understanding about funeral arrangements or estate procedures or any of the practical matters that adults typically handle when a loved one dies. It was clear that Mary Sullivan had been sheltered to an extraordinary degree, but no one suspected the true nature of her situation. It was only when Lily had tried to settle Catherine's estate that inconsistencies in their documentation had come to light, discrepancies that might have been overlooked by someone less thorough than Rebecca Martinez, the county clerk who processed property transfers for the rural district where the ranch was located. Rebecca had noticed that Mary Sullivan's birth certificate contained information that didn't match other documents in the file, and that several supposedly official papers bore the hallmarks of skillful forgeries. Her suspicions had led to an investigation that quickly escalated when authorities realized they might be dealing with a case of kidnapping and identity theft. DNA testing had quickly established Lily's true identity, but the psychological journey back to herself would prove far more complicated than the biological confirmation. Dr. Rebecca Taylor, the psychologist who specialized in cases of prolonged captivity and psychological manipulation, explained that Lily's situation was unprecedented in many ways. Unlike victims of more traditional kidnappings, she had not been held against her will in the conventional sense, but had been systematically brainwashed over decades into accepting a false reality as truth. The memories of her early life had not been erased so much as buried under layers of fictional narrative and pharmaceutical intervention. When Linda and David first saw their daughter, now 32 years old and a complete stranger to them, the reunion was nothing like the joyful embraces they had imagined during countless sleepless nights over the past quarter-century. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the state police headquarters, with social workers and psychologists present to monitor the interaction and provide support if needed. Lily sat across from them, at a long table, looking at these two grey-haired people who claimed to have loved her before she could remember, with polite confusion and barely concealed anxiety. She was smaller than they had expected, fine-boned and delicate in a way that spoke of years of simple food and hard physical work. Her hands were calloused from ranch labor, her skin weathered by sun and wind, her posture that of someone who had learned to make herself invisible when necessary. She wore a simple cotton dress that looked handmade, with careful stitching that suggested both skill and frugality, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. When Linda tentatively reached across the table to touch her hand, Lily instinctively pulled back with the reflexive caution of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected contact. The woman who sat before them was soft-spoken and cautious, with a voice that carried traces of regional accents from different parts of the country, as if she had learned to speak from people who themselves had come from many places. She called them Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, with the same formal politeness she might use with any strangers. And when Linda began to cry, Lily looked uncomfortable and unsure of how to respond to such emotional displays. The little girl who had once climbed into their bed during thunderstorms and insisted on helping with every household chore was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to survive in a world built entirely on lies, but who had also developed strength and resilience that they could only begin to appreciate. Dr. Taylor had warned them that the process of reintegration would be slow and difficult, complicated by the fact that Lily's entire adult identity had been constructed around a false narrative that now lay in ruins around her. She was grieving not only for the childhood that had been stolen from her, but also for the woman who had raised her under false pretenses, the only parent she could actually remember. Catherine Wallace had been simultaneously Lily's captor and her caretaker, the architect of her imprisonment and the source of whatever love and stability she had known during the past 25 years. The first few months were marked by confusion and setbacks that tested everyone's patience and resolve. Lily would have days when she seemed to accept the truth about her identity and expressed curiosity about her biological parents and the life she had lost. But she would also have periods when she insisted that her name was Mary Sullivan and demanded to know why these people were keeping her from going home to the ranch where she belonged. The fragments of recovered memory were often confusing and painful, mixing real experiences with the false narratives that had been constructed around them over decades of careful manipulation. She remembered blue sandals, but believed they had belonged to another little girl she had once seen in a story that Catherine had told her. She could hum melodies that Linda recognized as lullabies she used to sing, but she couldn't explain where she had learned them or why they felt familiar. She would sometimes startle at sounds that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place: the slam of a car door, the whistle of a tea kettle, the laughter of children playing in a schoolyard. But the memories that these sounds triggered remained frustratingly out of reach, like dreams that dissolve the moment you try to remember them clearly. Progress came in fits and starts, measured in small victories that sometimes felt insignificant against the magnitude of what had been lost. One day, Lily would seem to remember the taste of Linda's homemade apple pie and ask if she could learn the recipe, describing flavors and textures with the precision of someone whose mouth held the memory, even if her mind couldn't access it consciously. The next day, she would wake up calling for Catherine and insisting that she needed to get back to the ranch to take care of the animals who depended on her, becoming agitated and disoriented when reminded that Catherine was dead and the ranch had been sold to pay estate debts. The media attention was intense and often insensitive, transforming their private trauma into public spectacle in ways that felt like a second violation. News crews camped outside the Peterson home with telephoto lenses and boom microphones, hoping to catch glimpses of the woman who had literally returned from the dead. Reporters called at all hours with requests for exclusive interviews, offering substantial sums of money for access to a story that they promised to handle with dignity and respect. Documentary producers sent detailed proposals for projects that would honor Lily's courage, while generating the kind of ratings that made careers and won awards. The family's lawyer, Patricia Williams, worked overtime to protect their privacy and establish boundaries that would allow them to control their own narrative. She secured court orders that limited press access and established legal penalties for harassment, created a trust fund with proceeds from the few carefully controlled interviews they agreed to give, and negotiated contracts that gave the Petersons final approval over any content that used their story. Linda and David found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had never wanted, forced to navigate not only their daughter's recovery, but also public fascination with their remarkable story. Months passed before Lily had her first clear, undisputed memory of her life before the kidnapping. A breakthrough that came without warning on a snowy evening in December as she was helping Linda decorate their Christmas tree. They had been working in comfortable silence, hanging ornaments that Linda had collected over decades of marriage and motherhood, each one carrying its own story and significance. Linda had been telling her about the traditions they used to observe when she was small, how they would drive to the tree farm outside town to cut down their own pine, how David would string the lights while she and Lily made hot chocolate and sang along to Christmas carols on the radio. Lily had been holding a small ornament, a ceramic angel with yellow yarn hair and a painted blue dress, when something shifted in her mind like tumblers falling into place in a lock that had been sealed for 25 years. Suddenly, she could remember sitting at the kitchen table with construction paper and glue, carefully cutting out the angel's wings and painting them with watercolors that bled slightly at the edges. She could remember the proud satisfaction of finishing the project, The overwhelming joy on her parents' faces as they made space for it on the tree, the way her mother had lifted her up so she could place it on a branch where it would catch the light from the living room window. "I made this," she whispered, staring at the angel with wonder and confusion, her voice barely audible above the Christmas music playing softly in the background. "I remember making this for you. I was 6 years old, and Mrs. Patterson helped us make them at school for our families. I was so excited to surprise you with it." Linda began to cry. 25 years of held breath finally released in great, shuddering sobs that came from the deepest places of grief and joy and relief. David wrapped his arms around both women, and for the first time since that July morning, when Detective Santos had knocked on their door, they felt like something resembling a family. It was fragile and uncertain, built on a foundation that had been shattered and was still being rebuilt one memory at a time. But it was real and precious and worth every moment of pain they had endured to reach this point. The recovery process continued slowly but steadily over the following year, marked by breakthroughs and setbacks that became part of a new kind of normal for all of them. Lily began to remember fragments of songs Linda used to sing to her during bath time, games she had played with David in their backyard during long summer evenings, the way their house smelled like vanilla and coffee on Sunday mornings when they would sleep late and make pancakes together while still in their pajamas. She also began to grieve, not just for her lost childhood, but for the woman who had raised her under false pretenses and who had been the only source of love and stability she could actually recall. Dr. Taylor helped her work through the complex emotions surrounding her relationship with Catherine Wallace, explaining that the psychological term for what she was experiencing was trauma bonding, but acknowledging that the reality was far more complicated than any clinical definition could capture. Lily had to learn to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that Catherine had committed terrible crimes against her, while also genuinely caring for her in her own twisted and damaged way, that she could mourn the loss of her captor, while also celebrating her freedom, that healing didn't require her to hate the only parent she remembered, or to pretend that their relationship had been entirely false. As her memories gradually returned with increasing frequency and clarity, Lily also began to develop a fuller sense of all she had lost during those missing decades. She mourned for the adolescence she had never experienced, full of first crushes and school dances, and the awkward joy of discovering who she might become. She grieved for the friendships she had never formed, the shared experiences that bond people together through the common trials of growing up in the modern world. She felt the weight of the education she had been denied, not just the formal learning that happens in classrooms, but the social education that comes from navigating complex relationships with peers and authority figures and romantic partners. At 32, she was learning things that most people discovered naturally during their teenage years: how to read social cues and navigate workplace dynamics, how to use technology that had evolved dramatically during her captivity, how to exist in a world that had changed in fundamental ways since 1999. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or using an ATM required careful instruction and practice. The concept of social media was completely foreign to her, as were cell phones and GPS navigation and online banking and hundreds of other innovations that most people took for granted. But there were also unexpected gifts that emerged from her long captivity, strengths and skills that she had developed during those years of isolation that served her well in her new life. Lily had developed remarkable self-sufficiency and practical abilities during her years on the Montana ranch. She could cook elaborate meals from basic ingredients, combining flavors and techniques with an intuitive understanding of how foods work together. She could tend to sick animals with a gentleness and skill that came from years of caring for creatures who depended entirely on her attention. She could fix almost anything that broke around the house, having learned to be resourceful and creative with limited tools and supplies. She had a deep appreciation for nature and solitude that served her well during the overwhelming process of reintegrating into a society that often felt chaotic and artificial after decades of rural simplicity. Her perspective on what truly mattered in life had been shaped by years of living with only the essentials, and she often surprised her parents with insights that reflected hard-won wisdom about finding contentment in small pleasures and simple connections. She had learned to find joy in morning coffee and sunset colors, and the satisfaction of work well done, lessons that many people spend their entire lives trying to master. The blue sandals that had become such a symbol of their loss had been found preserved in an evidence box in the basement of the Riverdale Police Department, along with other items from Lily's initial disappearance case that had been carefully maintained even after the investigation went cold. Detective Riley, now in his 70s, but still sharp as a tack and deeply invested in the case that had haunted him for decades, had driven 6 hours from his retirement home in Florida to personally deliver them to the Peterson family when he learned about Lily's recovery. When he placed the small, faded sandals on their kitchen table with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred relics, time seemed to fold in on itself in ways that made the past and present feel equally real and immediate. The leather was cracked and discolored with age. The bright blue faded to a soft grey blue that spoke of years spent in storage, but they were unmistakably the same shoes that had carried their 7-year-old daughter across the playground on that last October afternoon. Lily stared at them for a long moment, reaching out with one tentative finger to touch the worn leather straps that had once been fastened around her small ankles. "I remember these," she said softly, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a piece of herself that she had thought was lost forever. "Grandma Ruth bought them for me at the mall. She said they were the exact color of cornflowers, and she let me wear them home from the store, even though Mom said I should save them for special occasions." It was the first time she had mentioned her grandmother by name, the first clear connection to her extended family and the web of relationships that had defined her early childhood. Ruth Peterson had passed away 12 years earlier, never knowing that her granddaughter had been found alive, never learning that the blue sandals she had chosen with such care had become a symbol of hope and loss, and the enduring power of love to transcend even the most devastating circumstances. Linda had been with her mother-in-law when she died, holding her hand in the hospital room while Ruth whispered Lily's name and asked if there had been any news, any sign that her granddaughter might still be alive somewhere in the world. By the 2nd anniversary of her return, Lily had legally reclaimed her birth name while keeping Mary as her middle name, a thoughtful compromise that honored both versions of her identity and acknowledged the complexity of a life that had been lived under 2 different sets of assumptions about who she was and where she belonged. She had moved into a small apartment near her parents, but not too close, establishing the kind of independent adult relationship that most families develop gradually over decades, but which they had to construct deliberately and consciously from the ground up. She had started taking classes at the local community college, beginning with basic subjects she had missed during her homeschooled years on the ranch, mathematics and science and literature and history that filled in gaps in her education, while also challenging her to think in new ways about the world and her place in it. Her professors were impressed by her dedication and her unique perspective, the way she approached familiar subjects with fresh eyes and asked questions that revealed both her intelligence and her unconventional background. The healing process was far from complete, and Dr. Taylor had been honest in explaining that it likely never would be entirely finished. There were still days when Lily woke up confused about where she was, still moments when the weight of lost time felt crushing and overwhelming, still triggers that could send her spiraling into anxiety or depression without warning. She attended therapy twice a week, and had learned to recognize the signs that indicated she needed additional support. developing coping strategies that helped her navigate the ongoing challenges of rebuilding an identity that had been fractured and reconstructed multiple times. But there were also increasingly frequent days when laughter came naturally and without effort, when the future felt full of possibility rather than fear and uncertainty, when the love that connected her to David and Linda felt stronger than the trauma that had tried to sever it permanently. She had made friends among her classmates and neighbors, people who knew her story but related to her as the person she was becoming rather than the victim she had been. She had discovered interests and talents that felt authentically her own, a gift for photography that captured the beauty she found in ordinary moments, a love of cooking that combined her practical skills with newfound creativity. Detective Santos, who had continued to work on related cases stemming from Catherine Wallace's criminal activities, discovered that Lily had not been the woman's only victim over the years of her operation. Evidence found at the Montana ranch suggested that Catherine had attempted to abduct at least 3 other children during the 1990s and early 2000s, though only one other case had been successful. That child, a boy named Michael Chen, who had been taken from a playground in Oregon in 2003, had been returned to his family after Lily's case broke open the larger pattern of Catherine's crimes, beginning his own long journey toward healing and reunion with parents who had never stopped searching for him. The ripple effects of Lily's case led to significant changes in how missing children cases were investigated and how long-term psychological captivity was understood and treated by mental health professionals. Dr. Taylor published several influential papers on the unique aspects of Lily's situation, helping to establish new protocols for working with victims of similar crimes and contributing to a growing body of research on the long-term effects of childhood abduction and psychological manipulation. The Peterson family became reluctant but effective advocates for missing children's organizations, sharing their story in carefully controlled settings to help other families maintain hope during their own dark periods of searching and waiting and wondering. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the house felt most like home, and the weight of their shared history felt like a blessing rather than a burden, Linda would sometimes find Lily sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out at the backyard where she had once played as a child, with the content expression of someone who had learned to find peace in simple moments. These instances of peaceful contemplation felt like small miracles, evidence that despite everything that had been taken from them, something precious and unbreakable had survived the worst that one human being could do to another. The little girl in blue sandals was gone forever, lost to time and trauma and the cruel randomness of evil that intersects with innocence. But the woman who had taken her place was learning to build a life that honored both who she had been and who she was becoming, creating something new and beautiful from the fragments of memory and the determination to not let the past define the future. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was everything that mattered. Perhaps love really could conquer all, even when it took 25 years to find its way home.